Hey, it's Mr. Blake, and this is the recording for those that are going to be retaking the demographic test on Monday. I'm going to give you kind of a short overview of the things you want to look at before you take that test. And again, the idea is you'll come to my Panther Den Zoom. I will open up the test for you and you can answer those questions. But these are the ones, the ideas and concepts that most people struggled with and so are going to reappear on that test. So I'm going to start off with the DTM and the ETM. Know your stages of the DTM, stage 1 through 4. We start off with agricultural society. We move to the developing, industrializing phase at stage 2. Stage 3, we're industrialized, urbanized. And at stage 4, we're post-industrial. We're moving away from industry and moving more into services and design and that sort of thing. And the reason why you need to kind of keep those 4 stages in mind is think about your demographic tools and how they change at each one of those levels. At stage 1, you're going to have a very high birth rate, very high infant mortality rate, very low life expectancy, and a very high infant mortality rate, for instance, because most people are on the farms. We don't have health care in the form of hospitals and stuff readily available. At stage 2, people are urbanizing. They're moving into the cities. They're starting to take those city jobs. And when that happens, your literacy rate goes up. Your infant mortality rate, though, drops very rapidly because families now have access to the hospitals and to clean water and stuff. So the things that would kill babies very early on at stage 1 are not present anymore. And so when you look at that as a population pyramid, for instance, this is where you get the triangle-shaped population pyramid. All those babies are still surviving, and your fertility rate and your birth rate are still relatively high. And so that's the reason why that population pyramid looks the way it does. By the time you get to stage 3, most of your population are living in cities. You start getting that Coke bottle-looking population pyramid, which means that your fertility rate and your birth rate are now starting to drop and drop relatively rapidly as well. And you also have an elderly population at the top of the pyramid because you now have the medical technology to keep old people alive. And so you're going to see more and more old people, and the base of the pyramid is going to start shrinking in. At this point, you should see very high literacy rates. Life expectancy should be going up rather rapidly. So again, think about how each one of these stages impacts those demographic tools. By the time you get to stage 4, your birth rate, your fertility rate are extremely low. Your infant mortality rate is extremely low. Life expectancy is much higher. You're going to have a whole lot more old people, which means that at this stage is when you are calculating your natural increase, you may end up with a negative number. You got to remember, births minus deaths get you your natural increase. Up to this point, it was probably a positive number, but at stage 4, it may drop because you've got fewer births than you do have deaths, and so it's a negative number. And if you're at negative numbers, you're in a shrinking population. And if you're looking at that population pyramid, it's upside down, or it looks like some sort of mutant carrot or something, because you're going to have people at the top, the old folks, but it's going to continue to narrow down at the bottom because people aren't having very many children. They may only be having one, or they may not having any at all. And so you don't have kids coming in on the population pyramid at the bottom. So anytime you see a population pyramid where it's shrinking at the bottom, that's probably what you're looking at. Look at the top and see if you got old people. And if you've got old people and fewer kids, that is definitely a post-industrial population pyramid. It means your population is shrinking. The other thing would be the ETM. First off, you got to think about why do we even have epidemiology to have an ETM. And that, of course, is Dr. John Snow of England, who did the very first scientific study on the causes of disease, which means that he's considered the founder of epidemiology. You might remember he was doing that research into trying to figure out why there was a cholera epidemic in London in the 1800s. So credit to him. He applied the scientific principles of the time to try to solve that particular problem and succeeded. So when we're looking at the ETM, kind of pair that up with the DTM, which is what I was trying to kind of show you in this unit, that if you're at stage one, you're an agrarian society, everything can kill us. Infection is present everywhere, disease is present everywhere, and we don't really have any medical technology to fend it off with. So everything can kill you at stage one. Stage two is when we start getting the infrastructure in place, like hospitals, clean water systems, sewage systems. People are moving into the cities, so they have access to this sort of stuff, which means that, again, it impacts your demographic tools. But in the medical case, this is where we start developing things like vaccines. We start developing the medical technology of sterile surgical wards and things like that. We start washing our hands and things before we decide to do medical stuff. And so your infant mortality drops, your life expectancy drops, and the diseases are probably not killing you anymore. Things like cholera and typhus and things like that. We've kind of put those behind us now. The thing that is probably going to kill you now is infection. That you'll have wounds that you cannot treat; they become infected. Septicemia sets in, gangrene sets in, and that's what you're probably dying from at this point at stage two. So it's no longer the endemic diseases that were always present with humanity. Now it's just the infections, wound infections and things like that, infections of the organs, whatnot. Stage three, we go into developing antibiotics, for instance. And so now we can fight off the infections. That's probably not going to kill you anymore. We start developing very simple organ transplants, for instance, kidneys and things like that. So people can live longer so long as they have some sort of replacement organ. And so now it is probably not infection that's killing you. Now it is cancer that's killing you. You are living long enough now to die of cancer because the other stuff is not killing you anymore. So now the big push at stage three is trying to find ways to deal with cancer. At stage three, most of it is going to be cutting it out using maybe radiation therapy or things like that. Very simple systems of dealing with cancer, and unfortunately rather ham-handed at it too. Stage four is where we get into the modern technology of robotic arms and robotic eyes. We start replacing failing organs with artificial ones. We can now do much more complex organ transplants, things like hearts and lungs and other much more difficult systems to try to repair and replace. We start developing gene therapy. We start developing chemotherapies for cancer. So at stage four, cancer is actually starting to move into the background. We can now treat cancer. So that may not be the thing that's killing you. Now it is probably something genetic, that the genetic diseases become the big killers. And so at stage four, the big research is dealing with gene science and repairing DNA or changing DNA so that these genetic diseases no longer exist in the population. Of course, stage five is the theoretical on the ETM, and it could well be, some sort of great new path in science, and suddenly we'll all become cyborgs or something. My guess is that is probably not what is going to happen. The probable most likely is the return of disease, that all those diseases that we thought were behind us, that we had cured, have still remained in society. They have still existed in the world, except for they have been evolving all this time, and they will evolve to become drug resistant and antibiotic resistant, much worse forms of them as they find new ways to infect human beings. So quite honestly, stage five is probably the return of pandemics and epidemics. And in fact, most of them would be pandemics because we live in a globalized society. So the countries that trade, the countries that have transportation systems all over the world are going to be spreading these diseases everywhere. And so we could well see the end of humanity at stage five as some disease comes up that wipes us all out, or perhaps more likely just most of us out, and the rest of us will be sitting around in the burning remains of what once was a great civilization, essentially back at stage one. We wouldn't have any medical technology to fight them off, and virtually everything could kill us again. So there's the cheery idea of the ETM stage 5, the negative version of that. All right. When we are thinking about that sort of thing, and thinking about population growth and that sort of thing, we should be thinking about, of course, Thomas Malthus and his idea of the population increasing exponentially, but not enough food supply to support that population, and then you'd suddenly have massive famines and die off of humanity. What he proposed brought us to the idea of a carrying capacity, the idea that regions of the world can only support X amount of human beings or whatever else it is that you're looking at with the resources that are there. And food is a resource, water is a resource. And so if we exceed our carrying capacity, we either die out or we have to find those resources somewhere else. They have to be imported into that area. So when you're looking at exceeding your carrying capacity, you are exceeding the ability of that region to support a human population of that size. And so in the past, that was the basis for famine and that sort of thing, and large die-offs of human beings. Nowadays, we can fix that, sometimes improving our technology. Think about the Green Revolution. This is how we modern do agriculture. In the 1950s and 60s, they did the improvements in agriculture using mechanized agriculture, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, new strains of plants that we were growing to become more drought resistant, disease resistant. And so we were able to increase the carrying capacity by producing more food. And that was hailed as a big success. That's why it's called the Green Revolution. Think of green being the new crops that we were growing. And so that is a big deal. And it is one of the things that people point to that are against Thomas Malthus, in that he made the assumption that agricultural production would stay at a pretty steady pace of improvement, when in fact we can have big spikes in improvement, which will keep our food capacity above that population line. So if you're an anti-Malthusian, one of the things that you'll say is that technology came to our rescue in the past, and it's probably going to come to our rescue in the future, because humans will come up with new ways to do things to provide the resources that we need. If you're a neo-Malthusian, you will say, well, that's a bunch of hooey, because the population continues to go up, and it's not just food. It could be water. It could be energy supplies. It could be whatever else that our societies are built on, and that we need on a day-to-day basis. And if we don't have enough of that, because the population continues to expand, well, then Malthus was kind of semi-right, that populations will go into decline. There will be famine. Civilizations will collapse because they don't have enough of an energy supply or enough water to go around. War will be a result, and so forth. So they will say that we have a rather grim future too, and it's not just based on food. We could exceed our carrying capacity in any of these other resources as well. So keep that in mind. Is there anything else that I would really focus on? Little things. Think about where most of the human population is located. What kind of country would you find most of the world's population, and where that growth is? Most of the world currently lives in a developing country. We don't tend to think about that, but it's true. Most of them are still in the early stages of industrialization. They still have very high birth rates, very high fertility rates still. And so if you're looking at the parts of the world that most of the population is in, and the areas that are growing the fastest, you're looking at the developing world. In particular, look at sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, has very high growth rates, very high fertility rates. And so a lot of the future growth is going to be in places like sub-Saharan Africa. The lowest growth rates are going to be things like Western Europe, Russia, Japan, Canada has a shrinking population. All of these are negative population areas where the natural increase of the population is actually shrinking. We would probably be in that position if it wasn't for migration. We have a lot of migrants coming into the United States, which tends to hold up our numbers. But when you look at your post-industrial societies, what we would kind of call the ecumene or the core countries, many of them, not all, but many of them have negative population growth. And so their populations are shrinking. And so you see the least growth in countries like that. All right, I hope this helps. Look over the chapter specifically on those sections that I mentioned, and we will knock this thing out on Monday. I will see you then.